Time wisely. And so we're just delighted to be here. I am Carol Lewis. I'm a professor of transportation studies at Texas Southern University. I used to direct our Transportation Research Center. I'm still affiliated with research. I am also a member of the Gulf Coast Rail District, so I thank Mayor Parker and Mayor Turner for allowing me to serve in that role. I'm going to introduce to you now the rest of our panel. And I'm going to start at my right, Christoph Spieler, a board member from Metro. And you're not on my list. Go ahead. You are on my list. Sorry, Kyle.
That's okay.
All right, well, let me go to my piece of paper because there's some changes. All right, so then, and I'm not going to go from my right. So then we've got Andy Mao. He's sitting right next to me from the Texas Department of Transportation. We have Maureen Crocker, representing Gulf Coast Rail District, Michael Moore, Texas Central Rail, and Abby Robertson, representing Texas Medical Center, and Alan Clark from Houston-Galveston Area Council. So thank all of our panel members for being here. Our purpose today is to help make sure that everyone in the room is on the same page and is, has the same starting point about what's going on at each of the agencies that are represented here and the various entities. And so first, I'm gonna ask a series of questions. I'm also going to ask them to describe to us what's going on at their agencies. Now, Michael has to leave like in seconds. So he's going to talk about Texas Central Rail right quick. He's going to give you an overview, and then I'm going to ask him one question, and then I think he's got to...
Yeah, I apologize. I had a long-standing commitment that I couldn't cancel. I'm Michael Moore with Texas Central. I'm the Regional Vice President. We're building the bullet train. It is the ultimate high-capacity transit system. I've been asked two questions to give a project update and the key factors of why Texas Central is building the high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas. Project update, it's a market-led project for the public good. It's a 240-mile project, 3 stations, Houston, Dallas, and Brazos Valley. Our technology is Shinkansen N700i. It's one of the safest, fastest, lightest high-speed trains in the world. Travels around 200 miles per hour. You can get from Houston to Dallas in less than 90 minutes. Again, I said it's a market-led approach. Had a very successful legislative session this session. We are now in the process of working for our draft EIS with the Federal Railroad Administration. We're expecting the draft EIS to be out this fall. We are also working with the Federal Railroad Administration for the rule of particular applicability, which are the governing rules for high-speed trains. There are no rules in the United States for a high-speed train because there are no high-speed trains in the United States. We have been for some time purchasing right-of-way options. We're over 30% of the parcels needed to build the train between here and Dallas. We've got over 50% in Grimes and Waller County. The reason we haven't gone more is because we have to wait for the draft EIS to come out so that we know exactly where the certain parts of the rail line are going to be. We are building this every day. We have teams of designers, engineers building this. We've announced Floor and Lane Construction as our design build partners. They are on the job. They've been working. They were actually working a month before we actually announced them recently. The key factors of why we are investing in high-speed rail and between Houston and Dallas. Our original partners that are still with us, traveled the world, and everywhere they went, they traveled on high-speed rail. They kept coming back to the United States and kept asking themselves why we don't have it. They put together a plan, they put together a study of looking at over 90 city pairs in the United States, and the #1 city pair that came up was between Houston and Dallas, and it's simple. If you're traveling less than 2.5 hours, you end up driving in your car. If you're over 3 hours, you fly. Dallas, this route it's only going to get worse. They're expecting it to go up to 6.5 hours by car. The populations, the other reasons, the population, we've got over 7 million people in Dallas, over 7 million people in Houston area, and we're connecting those two big metropolises. Those two, the population growth east of I-35 is going to double in the near future, and there need to be transportation alternatives. The train, we did a study recently, there are over 14 million trips between Houston and Dallas each year. 90% of those are by car. There need to be alternatives. There will still people be flying by plane, there will still be people driving, but we are providing an alternative that will, I should have mentioned this earlier, the train will leave every 30 minutes with 400 passengers during peak hours, every hour. Off-peak will be every hour, and then it'll close down at 5 hours for maintenance and cleaning during the night.
So how much time do you have from now?
I can take some questions, and I got to go.
Okay, good. So I'm going to ask the first one, and then, Alan, if it's okay, we'll see if there are a couple from the audience. But I'm curious, given what we've heard and, kind of this morning, what are you all at Texas Central Partners thinking about connecting to the rail? So, everybody's not going to be at the railhead in Dallas or the railhead in Houston.
Right.
So what are you all thinking about in terms of connectivity and integration?
We have had ongoing conversations with Metro, the city of Houston, the county. Our station will be connected to the systems they have. We are looking at when we are building a station from the ground up. So what that enabled us to do is to put the latest technology, the latest systems. We're going to make sure we're connected to the Metro Northwest Transit Center. We're going to make sure that they have these lanes that Uber needs, like Bob Urey was talking about, Uber and Lyft need to be pulled in. They're talking right now that when you get on your smartphone, you'll be able to book point to point, not just station to station. So we are thinking ahead. We're going to be working with our partners to make sure there is connectivity to the Energy Corridor, to the Galleria, to downtown, and other places, Med Center.
Okay. Are there a question or two from the audience before Michael has to carry on? All right. Well, thank you. Okay.
Councilmember?
So for that connectivity, I know we've talked about having rail connectivity to downtown. We've talked about having rail connectivity to downtown, but some of the other spaces and places, have you explored all varieties of modes, or is it a conversation about rail in terms of once people are in the city of Houston? I'm curious about some of the other corridors you just mentioned, because usually our focus has been downtown, so I'm curious to hear that.
Other corridors like to the Energy Corridor?
Yes, exactly.
We have to look at all the different population centers, work centers, to make sure we're connected to all of them. When we talk to Metro, it's not about just connecting to downtown, it's also connecting to the Energy Corridor. We're happy that Uptown District is going to be bringing the bus rapid transit. We will make sure that we're connected to that. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sorry I have to leave.
That's all right, thanks. All right, so I'd like to go now to Christoph Spieler. And so, Christoph, what I think I want to ask you is we're talking about high-capacity transit. And Metro obviously has park and rides and high occupancy vehicle lanes and managed lanes in your portfolio, as well as light rail. Share with us what you think characteristics are of corridors that perform well. So as we look at this high capacity transit for the region, what should we be thinking about? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think you can think of Metro as essentially having 3 transit networks right now, which all add up to one network. There's the park and rides, which we've heard a lot about, and we're carrying about 35,000 people between us and Woodlands Express and Fort Bend Transit on an average weekday on those corridors. It's one of the best commuter systems in the United States. Then there's the light rail, which is maybe a quarter as big a network, but it's carrying about 60,000. So you can really see how that sort of network in the denser core really picks up that ridership. And then you look at the local bus network, and that's 190,000. So one of the things I think is really important here in terms of transit is really to think about what are the kinds of places where transit works well. And the basic rule of transit is transit works when you have density. It works well when you have density at one end of the trip. It works really well when you have density at both ends of the trip. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the Houston region, I'm actually very encouraged there. We have a very significant area that has the kind of density that can support very good transit service. We've been looking at our Westheimer bus. The peak load point on the bus that runs from downtown to State Highway 6 is actually between Uptown and West Chase. There are more people riding the bus on Westheimer at Fondren than there are in Midtown. So I see Houston as having this significant urban core with a significant population that really stretches out to State Highway 6 on the west side, that stretches up to Greens Point on the north, down to Hobby Airport on the south. And I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there where places where people are already riding transit a lot to really improve the quality of that network. Some of the places where we need transit most are also the places where our buses are stuck in traffic the most. So I think one of the things we did well with reimagining is really start by looking at the data, really start by understanding the region, start by understanding where people are and where they're moving. And I think that's what we need to do with transit, really identify those places where the maximum demand is, realize we have multiple centers, and realize that we have actually considerable pieces of this region that not only have a lot of people living in them right now, but have a lot of potential for redevelopment for more. When we say new population is going to be moving to the fringe, that's not a statement of fact. That's a projection based on our current transportation investments. That's a projection based on saying we're going to keep investing in highways that support that development. If we make different transportation investment decisions, those population patterns could look very different.
Okay. All right, so part of what Christophe was talking about meshes with TxDOT and the right-of-way where we've got the managed and HOVs in the middle of the freeway. Before I go to Andy Mao, I want to go to Alan and ask him to talk a bit about how you see the agencies working well together so that, you know, as we go forward, it's not just Metro working on Metro and TxDOT working on TxDOT, but we end up kind of doing a fuzzy line in terms of what we need with our transportation future.
Well, I think what Carol's talking about is to make sure that as we move forward, everybody's around the table. So that we're kind of used to thinking that the person who is looking to make an investment, a construction activity, plans that investment, and then maybe they talk to other people, maybe they don't, depends on what it is and where it is. And we want to change that paradigm to where everybody's at the table from the beginning. In fact, I would say, let's move that back a step. Let's get consensus about where we want to go, what kind of system we want to build, and then as we look to make investments in different pieces, we'll have a lot better idea of the folks that need to be in the room when we're planning that investment. Now, that's not saying we don't do that today. I don't think we have done it as well as we need to. A good example of working together is some of the corridor investments that we've been discussing, like the North Corridor. But even there was a sense in the community that the transit elements were perhaps not as much of a upfront consideration as they could have been. So it's not a matter of any one agency or any one group being able to not doing the job they should. I think it's a matter of us building a way of advancing all of our planning work. So the first thing we think about is, okay, how does this fit into the overall system, and who needs to be here to talk about it? And maybe even some people that we don't think need to be there, but we don't know yet, because we certainly don't understand what the future is going to be in all of its dimensions. Mm-hmm. And I think there could be a big role, for example, for the private sector, not just in the development and construction of our transportation network, but in the actual operation of it. One of the things about automated vehicles that excites me is it will bring down potentially the cost of operating mass transportation services. Maybe we'll see mass transportation become more of a private sector opportunity, the way Uber and Lyft are becoming private sector alternatives for not just taxi services, but even owning and operating your own car. So I think it starts with having an idea of where we want to be in the future, having as much of a plan as we can develop, understanding what we can about how the parts need to work together, and then as we approach each investment, making sure we've got a big table and everybody there.
This morning, we heard Bill Brudnick and John Breeding talk about how TxDOT had worked with them on the bus lanes. And I think John even mentioned something beyond that up at the northern end where TxDOT is paying for some things. So Andy, would you speak a little bit about other corridors that you think that either TxDOT is working on, or talk to us about, sort of the next hot spot? What's on the horizon?
When you heard about the term, say, it takes a village, it really does in transportation. And TxDOT being infrastructure, transportation, mobility business for 100 years, and we're still learning. And I think we work the best when we work with all our mobility partners, whether that's metro, city, county, management district, and I think our goal is the same, try to move the traffic. And in terms of high capacity transit realm, I'm thinking back, the HOV lanes development, back in the late 70s, when North Highway was using those pylons, I still remember, was manually put it in, and it was a truck. That was a real nice operation. Until today, the North Highway Improvement Project, what do you call that? Max lane, hot lane, managed lane, diamond lane, all of that we're improving because, number one, we're trying to move more people through the corridor. Because with all the economic development, the vibrancy of the economic in the region and the growth, it just continuously put more pressure on the already congested network that we have. And we just had to put more people through the corridor because the widening has become pretty limited. And the North Highway will be the latest example. I don't think we're widening much about the general purpose lane. Everything is toward the middle, because that try to encourage people to either, instead of, I always heard our story told me, this is a Lone Star state, everybody want to drive by themselves. But if we can have 2 people in there, we can have 3 people in there, we can have a van pool, we can have a 45 people bus. We can move more people through the corridor. And the HOV lane is exactly trying to do that by providing incentive in terms of saving in the travel times. But more importantly, because in the big city, we know it's going to be delayed, but it's more predictable travel time, more reliable travel time that you try to get to from point A to point B. So I think we are doing several, what we call the PEL study. It's a planning environmental linkage study. It's the what we call the major investment study in several corridors. And all those corridors we're going to consider multimodal. And you have I-10 East, 59 from Spur 527 going all the way to Beltway A. And on the North Highway, picking up from Beltway A, go further north all the way to the district line. And we're doing several of those major studies and try to go to the future.
Okay. So in the earlier.
That's my question.
Okay. Yeah, council member.
Question is for Andy. So I have a question with regard to, you talked about multimodal options as being part of what you see going forward with TxDOT, but as we know, a lot of the funding on a state level is restricted and it doesn't support multimodal transit options. Can you kind of enlighten us on how the funding restrictions relate to the plans that you're describing?
Right. That's why I say we work the best with all our mobility partners. So our funding are limited to certain, usage. So we will use that funding to do what's allowed within our funding source. And then we will need other partners to, for example, we can probably build the managed lane with the Metro, FTA, and all that as part of our highway project. But we need somebody else to provide the service on that, to do the other things. So we need a partnership, which we have. We had this partnership with Metro since the 80s, to do I think we have about 120 miles of these HOV system in this region already.
Just so that we can all be on the same page about that, is there any movement or, the mayor has described the need, and I remember one of the first speeches he gave as mayor was going up to talk to TxDOT and share, the need, at least here in this region, for a paradigm shift. And I know that certainly Metro and HGAC are working on trying to get additional funding down from various resources, but having the state funding could also aid in that. Is there any activity or efforts or any leadership pushing in that direction on a state level?
All depending on what exactly you're talking about. There are different funding. HGAC can probably speak to that. On the federal funding side, you have FTA money, can do certain things, buying buses and those kind of things, and bus operating facility. And TxDOT money is more for the infrastructure, for the service side of the deal, and until that's changed, because our money is called the highway fund, from the old days, as we will call highway department, and so there's a lot of restriction on the money that we receive, from the either the state or from the federal.
So this might be a time, and I want to get our other panelists involved, but it might be a time for Alan to talk about the CMAQ and STP funds that do come to the region and are not restricted by mode. And I'd use the initials, but go ahead and call out the real names.
Well, I think what Carol's saying is that there's areas where we have some funding flexibility and some where we do not. What we'd ideally like to do is to let the investments, based upon their performance, be available for funding under the resources we have available. And we can't fully do that because of all these restrictions. But at least when we are talking locally about what our funding priorities are, we're trying to find a way to make sure that transit and highway can be considered together or as alternatives to each other. And a good example was the Post Oak Busway project, which competed for funding, some of the flexible funding that HGAC has, as in the same criteria we use for highway projects. So they showed how they would be cost effective. They showed how they would support economic development, how they would reduce vehicle emissions, how they would promote safety. So I think the problem is now we are so restricted legislatively in how money can be used within the state. It's becoming increasingly possible to make every tool in the toolbox available. The same is true, for example, with being able to use priced facilities, toll roads. Now, those are highly restricted with state funding. So, we're going to have to look to our legislature to understand where the best investment is, why it makes sense and dollars and cents, and to consider changes which would allow the Texas Department of Transportation to be a Department of Transportation and not just the Highway Department. I can tell, I'm going to give you a personal opinion. I think TxDOT is ready in a minute. If they could look at transit investment in at least in the infrastructure side, look at rail as in freight rail investment to move goods. They are cooperating to the extent they can, but it's not a lack of their understanding of the value those have. I think it was great that the voters supported additional funding for the highway programs, the last two Proposition 1 and 7 legislation, but included in that was constitutional language that restricted to highways only, and in one case eliminated tolls as a possible investment as well. So we're not in the best position as a state to take a multimodal approach, but we're still working very hard to do that. Now, in Washington, I won't get into that much more, but there's still a lot of transportation silos when it comes to funding, and we talk about it all the time, how to bust those down so that we can make the best choice, whatever that choice is. Our Transportation Policy Council gets it. We don't try to define our funding around modes of transportation. We try to make sure that doors open where it can be, but the flexible funding becomes scarcer and scarcer. And it's not like we have a lack of investment in highways across, I mean, a need for more, we have a huge need for more investment in highways across our region as well.
Right.
I don't know
So,
if I answered that question or not, Carol,
I
if it
think
was
you-
a question.
it was, but no, I do think you answered it, and I think you portrayed exactly part of our position and our struggle.
Let's, in our answers, just as Andy did, include what you are currently doing. Yeah, 'cause that's a really important part of this workshop. What current studies, if any, I mean, I know what Christoph's doing. He's designing the regional transit plan with our planning group, but from Metro's perspective. But if you'd include that too, just because we do want to leave here today with a sense of who's doing what.
Okay. All right, so talking about partnerships, we've talked about Metro and TxDOT. Maureen Crocker from Gulf Coast Rail District, I know that the Gulf Coast Rail District has got a memorandum of understanding with Texas Central Partners, and other work is underway. And an advisory committee has been formed and working on West Park Corridor. Would you talk to that, please?
The rail district is kind of unique in the region because it includes the participation of 5 counties. And when it was originally created, the mandate was to focus on freight bottlenecks, but also to try to incorporate passenger rail into the network. And that was the primary impetus for most of the counties joining, is the focus on passenger operations, because there is a recognition from the counties, Montgomery, Galveston, Waller, and Fort Bend, that there's a need for some long-distance commute assistance. So when the rail district has looked at passenger rail corridors, we focused on the long commute and really with that travel time. So fewer stops, higher travel speeds to try to get people from a longer distance into the city. And we've done that primarily along 3 corridors. The 90A corridor, which is the Glidden subdivision owned by Union Pacific Railroad, and then the 290 corridor, which is the Eureka subdivision owned by Union Pacific Railroad, and also West Park, which is uniquely publicly owned, so it is an opportunity quite different. When the rail district started, we looked at existing freight rail right-of-way and trying to incorporate passenger operations onto those tracks. And initially there was cooperation from the railroads with that, Union Pacific in particular. But when the economy changed and their business model in the Houston region changed, they made it very clear that they did not believe they had now or in the future will have the capacity to add passenger operations within their right-of-way. They want to save all of their right-of-way for moving freight because they see a lot of growth in this area. With that, we kind of shifted gears and said, okay, what if we build upon the transportation corridors they've created with their freight rail and try to acquire right-of-way immediately adjacent to them? So we looked at that in all 3 corridors. In 90A, Metro's already doing a lot of work, so we've kind of backed off of that corridor. In 290, we've looked at the right-of-way that TxDOT has identified in their study, and also we've looked at the right-of-way that Texas Central has identified and the potential for operating a commuter system below the high-speed rail system. So whereas they're not really going to stop between Houston and Dallas, trying to incorporate some stops more locally that could pick people up and both feed into the high-speed rail system, but also feed into the city of Houston and the major activity centers there. And then finally in West Park, we're looking at connections from the western Fort Bend County line into the city. And in all three of those corridors, the biggest challenge beyond right-of-way is getting inside 610. And the right-of-way, even when we were looking at the freight rail, using the freight rail, that's where it was the most congested, and they would not allow the rail district to try to operate in there. So that's always been a challenge, is how do you get into the central business district? And now when we look outside of the right-of-way, trying to buy right-of-way inside of 610 is very expensive and perhaps impossible because it's so densely developed. So even with the West Park corridor, which is publicly owned, once you reach this 610 area, you run out of right-of-way and can't get into downtown. So that is the challenge that we face, and we're now trying to work with TxDOT and Metro on how to address that. And I think, interestingly, Metro faces almost the opposite problem, is the Harris County line. So I think we need to try to bridge that, looking at bringing the long hauls in and meshing them with Metro or some other service that can then continue a quick trip to the final destinations, to the major activity centers that are within the core area. And we can't really rely on local service for that, because if you take somebody that's been sitting on a bus or a train since Fulshire, and then once they get to 610 have to make 8 or 10 stops to get downtown or the medical center, you've probably just doubled their travel time. So it's going to be a little bit of a model change, probably even for Metro or TNCs or whoever picks up that local service. But we've got to somehow mesh an express long-distance service with an express short-distance connection.
Okay, thank you. A long time ago, when we had a recession in the 90s, John Breeding's getting outed again, made a comment that the only place that there were cranes were in the medical center, the Texas Medical Center. And I haven't forgotten that, and although we've got cranes all over town now, but I was driving down, I don't know, Herman or something, and I thought, oh, we still got cranes in the medical center. So Abby, could you talk about what you all are doing there and transportation considerations going forward?
Absolutely. Well, and I apologize we were not able to be here for the panel this morning. My name's Abby Robertson. I'm the Vice President of Planning at the Texas Medical Center. So as you can imagine, mobility and transit is something that is a key focus for me on a regular basis. TMC is fully supportive of high-capacity transit and diversified mobility options, and we are a critical care center here in the city, a major employer. As you were saying, there's always seems to be a crane doing something at TMC. We have 50 million square feet of development. 3 million square feet is currently underway, and there's about 3 to 5 million more that's planned in the coming years. We're not quite there yet, but we really are nearing capacity on our surface system, and so this discussion about additional mobility options and high-capacity transit is extremely important to us as we look ahead. Some of the things that we're looking at right now, some of the key initiatives to Maureen's question, I think, from a little bit earlier this morning, are really those last-mile connections, making sure that we are looking at bike share. That's something that we're working on implementing right now, consolidating and optimizing our shuttle system. With 100,000 employees, we have many different shuttle systems that are operating on our campus, and so how can we begin to optimize those and really be thoughtful about how we're using the surface streets and networks. But we're also looking at understanding these shifts in the transit options and behaviors, as well as the impacts of these new technologies and what that means for us as we move forward into the future. So we are so glad to be a partner as part of this discussion and supportive of mass transit. And so I'm glad that we're having these discussions as a group, and as you were saying, bringing everyone to the table. We think that that's really important for us and the success in the future.
Good.
Let me add something. One thing that we're doing that also involves the medical center is I think Dr. Robbins, before he left, had come up with the idea of a connector throughout the medical center that maybe Metro would help operate. And then the mayor expressed an interest in extending that to the parks, the museum district, that whole area. And so that's something I know is somewhere on the drawing boards there, and for us as well.
Absolutely, and Tom and I actually were speaking about this a little bit earlier this morning, and some of that idea grew out of this notion of consolidating the shuttles that we have. TMC has shuttles, MD Anderson, Texas Children's. There's numerous shuttles that are operating in and around TMC, and we want to make sure that we are being, again, thoughtful about our surface network of streets, and so is there an opportunity to consolidate those within TMC? But then how does that expand to the neighboring district? So it could expand to the museum district and other areas and connect everybody together as part of a bigger strategy. So that's absolutely something, a discussion that we're pushing forward.
One of the things I like about where this discussion is going is this realization that when we build transit, the best transit serves multiple purposes. Like some of the best circulators are also line haul systems. Like the Main Street line within downtown works as a really effective circulator within downtown. It also gets you to the Texas Medical Center. And so the more we can find transit systems that serve multiple purposes, the more effective we will be. And another really big lesson, and the Med Center I think this is one of your biggest challenges, is effective transit really needs to get into the middle of things. It doesn't work if we drop someone off at the edge somewhere and say good luck. And the problem is the middle of things is where the most congestion is, where the real estate is the tightest, where the institutional relationships and the politics are the most difficult. So like Maureen said, when we're looking at bringing people in from outside the city in, ideally we are going to let them stay on one vehicle until they are able to step out and take a bike or walk to their final destination. And a lot of our biggest challenges in terms of planning are in these congested centers where everyone's trying to get to.
And another point about the medical center is that I think the concept was also a people mover. So that's yet another purpose of our task force, is to consider all types of transportation.
So earlier, Christoph, I think, made what I considered an excellent point that said we need to start by understanding the region. So Kyle, representing the Kinder Institute, talk to us about what you're doing to help us understand the region.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're doing about transit, or have done in the last year and are currently doing, focuses more on walkability and bikeability. So we've been in a number of conversations with TMC and B-Cycle, have done a couple of studies about bike share and street safety at kind of that most basic level for walkers and bikers. And then increasingly in the next couple months, we'll be looking sort of at land use and transit in connection. And then I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight that for our purposes as a task force, I think that meshes with what Christoph just said is everyone's favorite Kinder Houston area survey and what Steve Kleinberg has been tracking for years. I think when we look at some of the attitudinal questions about transportation and the types of homes and the types of neighborhoods people want, we're really at an interesting tipping point for people are more interested and more willing now to look for places that are interconnected. That doesn't mean no cars, but that they have many options. So this last year, the question that blew me away was that 57% of respondents would rather be in a denser area with multiple transit options and amenities than in a single, and 37% said kind of traditional suburban single-family homes and cars. So again, it's not for everybody, but we're in this moment where there's clearly an appetite for let's create these effective, bold transportation interconnections for all these modes, and there are residents in Houston, I would argue more than probably ever before, interested in seeing those. And it's both an opportunity and a risk, because if we don't do it successfully, I think it will go the opposite way, right? It's that idea, if I take it once, I've never taken it before, and it doesn't work for me, I'm probably not going to take it again.
So one of the things you said that's always been important to me in my advocacy is that a lot of times we think of our transportation decision as all or nothing. Either I'm a transit rider or I take my car. And I think one of the things that's hugely important is that we begin to help our region think of ourselves as people who look at every trip and say, is this trip for transit and biking, or is this trip for the car. And, you know, in all of our households, that we mix those trips. And when we talk about that, I guess I would ask the question to all of us at the table, how are you and your agency, you know, kind of thinking about that and helping that idea that maybe I, you know, take transit to dinner and then I Uber back home? What's going on in your agencies that might help with that moving forward? And you know, in the medical center, even same thing. Start maybe at the end. Christoph.
Well, I'll say, I mean, one of the big things we're working on and really coming out of the Reimagining Project and what we've been hearing from our riders is we can't think of a transit rider as a stop-to-stop experience. It's a door-to-door experience. And in Houston, often the biggest issue with transit is between the front door and the transit stop. Just basic sidewalk conditions, the importance of urban design, the importance of accessibility. So one of the things we're really doing as an agency is figuring out how to focus on that scale, not just drawing big lines on maps, but figuring out how they become a part of that connected pedestrian bike network that gets people to where they actually need to go.
So Kyle, let me ask you also, in some of your kinder studies and what you're going to do going forward, you kind of mentioned that 57% of folks would rather live in these networks. Are you all going to do another set of the questioning coming up? And are you still looking at public perception maybe of high capacity transit in the way that this committee might be interested in?
Yes, so the Houston Area Survey is kind of that great tool for that, and it has had a consistent stream of questions around that I'm happy to bring to the task force throughout. And yeah, it has, you know, some of them show kind of the, not ambivalence, but still divided attitudes about what the region needs, right? So would I ride transit if it was markedly better than it was today is still, or would I continue to drive my car? More people still say I would continue to drive my car, but again, that number is inching closer to 50% above from where it used to be down in the low 30s, right? So it's now up to, I think, almost 40%, and it's been going up every year. So again, I think it's those trends towards the region, wherever you are, right? It's not just, that survey is not just Central Houston. This concept of wanting to see those many options that work for individuals, whatever that entails, becoming much more palatable.
Okay. So now might be a good time to ask if there are other members of the task force and the work group that have any questions they'd like to ask the panelists.
Carol, I want to jump in with something. This has been a great discussion. One of the things I see is a huge problem is just the whole issue of choice. We don't have one in most of our region. We have a metro service area that has some great choices in it, but I know even Metro would like to be able to expand accessibility to certain areas like the energy corridor, which may be in the metro service area. Part of it's not, but in a large part of our region where we have a lot of growth and development, especially the jobs, we do not have transit as a real choice there today. And it has everything to do with all the elements of it. How do I get to transit? How do I get to my job once I get off the transit vehicles? Do I need to make connecting trips? So Clark Martinson mentioned he's looking at Woodlands to the energy corridor. There's no transit service like that today, and it certainly extends beyond the metro service area. So we have some real hard decisions to help our residents and local governments think about, particularly those that are today outside or just outside the metro service area and can almost taste how easy it would be to make those next connections, but they have to overcome a lot of perceptions and have to think about how they're going to, what is the appropriate financial support, especially the local support that's going to be needed to leverage over their opportunities and make that happen.
Okay. Andy?
Slightly different angle. One of the questions that we've been asking ourselves is, because majority of the people in this region still drive alone. And the fundamental problem we have is, how do we get those population from driving alone into something else? I think getting into a bus, that probably is the furthest away from people driving alone because all the convenience and all that. but how about some other options that we mentioned earlier, mobility on demand, mobility as a service? Those are new terms. Those are the younger generation seems to embracing that. Textile Houston District recently received a federal grant it's a technology grant. Basically, we try to build a platform using big data analytics to help people overcome all the friction to get out of the single occupant vehicles. If you look at today, you ask yourself, why am I not doing something else? Why am I not trying some other option? Even though they might be limited, but they are there because it's information. You don't have that information. Everything is kind of siloing in different, you have it on different websites. So what we're trying to do is to do 2 different pilot area, and the energy sector is one of them, and downtown is another one, is to tie all these different mobility services, be a bus, Uber, Lyft, whatever shared service, and we try to tie that to a platform. And to the user will be an app on your cell phone. And you can see all the way from the beginning to the end, all the information, all the choices. Kind of like go to the website, try to search the lowest airfares, right? You have all the information available, all the best hotel deal. And we try to do that for the mobility, for transportation. So that's coming. And so this is one term that we're using is called the total capacity, because as a Department of Transportation, like I said, we've been real good doing hard capacity. But the total capacity meaning hard capacity plus soft capacity. And what is soft capacity? Is those empty seats in your transportation mode, whether that's the bus, or you're driving alone, or you got 3 empty seats, or that sidewalk nobody's riding, nobody walking, nobody taking a bike. Whatever is available to you, whatever that best fit your lifestyle. And we also need to think about, people have different kind of trip purpose in the day. The reason they're not taking it because you took care of the commuting part.
Yeah.
But once they get to the destination, they got other trip purpose needs. They need to run an errand, they need to go to lunch. How do you take care of that? If you can take care of that entire day for anybody, you have a better chance to take them out of their single occupant vehicle into something different.
May I add something to that?
Please.
On the total capacity point, going back to the rail district and its focus on both freight and commuters, I think it would be of value for in either the task force's analysis of economic benefits or maybe when HGAC starts looking at things, but does high-capacity transit have the potential to move enough vehicles, single-occupant vehicles, off the road to create more capacity for freight? Because one thing we haven't talked about today is the number of trucks that are coming to this region that are just going to make the commuter problem twice as bad, if not more so. So if we can, by taking people off the road or putting more people in one vehicle and take up less space, there's going to be more room for those trucks. And those trucks are key to this region's growth. And so we've got to be able to somehow accommodate that.
Excellent point.
To follow up on Maureen's point, one entity that's not here is the group that's studying the freight question. I guess it's being led by Judge Emmett. Is that right, Alan?
Yes, and HGAC is doing some of that work in freight planning.
Do you have any sense of timing of when we're going to get information about what are the results of that freight planning? Because, we knew that the scope within this room and within this task force could not, envelop that topic as well, since it was already being kind of studied, and we didn't want to duplicate efforts. But do you know what the timing is of that? Because I think it is something relevant to the broader conversation.
That work will be mostly finished in the next year. It goes a little bit beyond that, but we are looking at both short-term and long-term things, and there is actually overlap. So we talked about the max lane idea. What if outside the peak period we were platooning trucks down those max lanes to destinations? Or talking about outside the peak period, what if we could help the supply chain work effectively at night? We are not going to be able to create instant capacity, but that's not stopping our growth. So we know we have to look at short and long-term things. And then a lot of the other parts of it have to do with access, connectivity, and potentially long-range, creating new corridor opportunities for moving goods to and from our region, because we're not only supporting our own growth and development, we're supporting the growth and development of the state and the country. And so we're really the gateway for the Texas Triangle in many ways. So it's not just what's happening here. But those are the considerations that we're making. It was mentioned about the corridor studies that TxDOT's going to be doing, moving more people in fewer vehicles and moving more freight down these highways are right up at the top of Andy's list of things that he's worried about. And then that also gets into some other topics too. But in any event, we will hear more about that this coming year. The study's an 18-month effort, and it just recently started.
So if there are no other questions, my looking at the clock says that we've extended the time of this panel to its end point. And I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel. I think they've given us some great takeaways, and I made about 10 points that I'll pass along to Alan from comments. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, and while our panelists are moving back to their chairs, we're going to now break up into our 3 work groups. As I said, we've only have a limited time, but we certainly can talk about what we hope each work group can achieve and when we can get together next. And I need some help about which work group is where. I think in this room, we have the service concept work group, so just stay put if you're part of that group. The financial funding work group is going to meet where, Euless? In the training rooms. They leave that do they exit this room? Go ahead. And then after you're done with your work group, you are welcome to leave. That'll be the conclusion of our workshop.